Welcome to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM for Monday, December 9th. I'm Andrew Walworth, and I'm joined by RCP President and co-founder Tom Bevan and Washington Bureau Chief Carl Cannon. So we have updates on two important criminal cases that have really gripped America. A person of interest is in custody for the murder of the United Healthcare CEO, Brian Thompson, and a jury found Daniel Penny not guilty for the death of Jordan Neely, who he had held in a chokehold on the New York subway back in May of 2023. So, Tom, both of these cases seem to have hit a political nerve. What do you make of these latest developments?
Well, it's a good day for justice. Daniel Penny, that case should never have been brought, most likely, and the fact that it was tried and then tried the way it was, I think was somewhat of a disgrace. Alvin Bragg, sort of showed who he was again. And so I'm glad to see that, a lot of people were questioning whether a New York City jury would have the fortitude to find him, not guilty. And they did. So kudos to the jury for that. And then in the other case, I mean, we're going to learn more about this individual, but it looks like he's a ex-Ivy League student, climate change activist, sort of left-wing person. And I'm going to be interested to hear a lot more about him and what his motives were. But it looks like, from what I've seen from the reporting, he showed a fake ID. It was the same fake ID that was used to check into the hostel in New York City. Looks like they've got the guy. They found a gun that matched the one at the crime scene, or that was on the videotape anyway. And so I'll be interested to learn a lot more about why this young individual, 26 years old, decided to do what he did.
Yeah. Carl, what do you make of the two cases?
Well, we can just dispense with a trial of the second guy. Tom's convicted him already.
I have not. I said it looks like. It looks like.
I've thought all along that the assassin was going to be a left-wing person, Antifa type, who'd been radicalized. And that fits the profile of this person who was detained in Pennsylvania on Monday, but we'll have to learn more, and it's hard to comment on it. But on that person, but this clearly to me was an act of terrorism, and these imbeciles who started using it as an excuse to attack the victim and criticize United Healthcare. That's not really. It was beyond the pale. It was a cowardly assassination of a father of two from behind, and it's in a political act, an act of political terrorism. I hope that they have got the right guy.
Yeah, what sort of ties the two together is this idea of sort of a vigilante justice, though, I think. Very different cases, obviously.
Oh, come on, Andy. This case in New York wasn't vigilante justice at all. This guy's on the wait, no, hold on. He's on the subway. This guy approaches menacingly.
Well, I wish you would let me finish what I'm saying, Carl, but go ahead.
All right. You're right. I interrupted. You go ahead.
I'm saying they were very different, but they're perceived as vigilante justice by a lot of people. And that seems to be sort of in keeping, Carl, with the moment.
I don't know about that, Andy. The two cases are so different that in some ways they're the opposite. This young man in New York was trying to protect people. He's trying to protect perfect strangers from a menacing individual who probably shouldn't have been on the streets at all. In Alvin Bragg's New York, you can do a lot of different things, but lie to your own checkbook, try and put you in prison. But terrorize people on a subway, you can do that over and over again. It's unfortunate that he died instead of getting the mental health care that he needed, and I would say deserved. But using Daniel Penny as a scapegoat, Daniel Penny as a scapegoat, I share Tom's views about that. I thought it was appalling to charge him with manslaughter. What did you think, Andy?
No, I thought it was, I don't know if appalling is the right word for it, but I think justice was served in his case, and I hope justice is served in this other case. I guess what I was referring to is I was sort of surprised. We talked about it on Friday, Carl, you weren't here, about how people on the internet especially were sort of almost justifying, if not celebrating,
we
the
saw
murder
some
of this healthcare executive.
Yeah, well, I wasn't there,
and
so
how
I couldn't.
strong that feeling was out there.
Well, to me, it's knee-jerk performative art. I don't know if it's a strong feeling or not. I noticed you guys have Taylor Lorenz still at the Washington Post, and I thought, well, I can't take any more days off because that paper got rid of her. But yeah, she, look, there's some loose screws on the internet, and we've talked about this before. How do you get 1 million followers? How do you get prominent? How do you get big contracts on cable news? You say outrageous things. And to me, we shouldn't say outrageous things in response to it. But this is not something. If you celebrate this, if you don't condemn it, you celebrate domestic terrorism and murder against people who you may disagree with politically, and that's painting yourself into a corner pretty quickly. Because if somebody they like was assassinated, they wouldn't feel the same way. And then you have to explain to people like that and use very small words. Childlike logic. You see, you didn't like when it was done to your side, so you can't celebrate it's done to the other side.
Tom?
Well, look, I generally agree with Carl, but I mean, there is, to your point, a little bit, Andy, and I don't. Again, this should be an easy no-brainer. You condemn cold-blooded murder on the streets of New York City, regardless of what your gripe is with the healthcare system. Now, are there problems with the healthcare system? Sure. I mean, was this guy maybe not the best guy in terms of, apparently he was being investigated for stock trading, dumping some stock and making some money, and okay, but still, it doesn't justify him being, again, assassinated in cold blood. So I think we can separate the two and say, we have to condemn things like that, but we can also acknowledge that, okay, maybe there are problems with the healthcare system, but that's not the way you go about handling it. And again, we'll learn more about this young man, who if he is in fact the person who committed this crime, why he thought it was justified, why he would basically throw away his life in order to do this, because that's exactly what he's done.
Well, Carl, I don't want to belabor this point, but it does. I guess what I'm saying is that what surprised me about the healthcare story was that people didn't react the way I think we reacted, at least on Friday, which was, this is a horrible thing. And then when the sort of trolls of the internet, and there were, some mainstream press people as well, like I said, sort of justifying it, or at least trying to explain it away, I was sort of shocked. What I saw over the weekend was how a lot of people doubled down on that, and it became sort of, like I say, I mean, people weren't so much justifying as explaining it. And I found that shocking, that when we looked at polling back during the election, healthcare wasn't really, we talked about this, healthcare wasn't really an important issue, but apparently maybe we missed something.
Well, Andy, but this is not a story about healthcare. This is a story about domestic terrorism and political violence. That's the distinction I'm trying to make. And you want to know a poll number that's shocking. It's not that more people didn't think healthcare was the #1 issue in the country. It's that a startling number of people, percentage of people, think that if you don't get your way in an election, violence is justified. Jack Hamilton had a column for us on this recently, and you can, if you're listening to this or watching our podcast, you can go find it. It's John Maxwell Hamilton. That's the really disturbing thing, Andy, is that too many Americans have lost the plot here. When politics becomes your religion instead of an actual religion, it doesn't have the guardrails. It doesn't have the moral.
Right. Well, I think we're in agreement on that.
Yeah.
Hey, so you're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Tom and Carl. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back right after this. Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Tom Bevan and Carl Cannon. And let's talk about Syria. The government of Bashir Assad collapsed in the face of the rebels this weekend. He is reportedly now in Russia, having fled the country. It's a very complicated situation. Biden called the regime collapse a fundamental act of justice, Tom, and Trump wrote, "This is not our fight." So what do you make of this? And, we often say that there's one president at a time in the United States, but that seems to be being turned on its head a little bit lately.
Yes, and look, I'm not a Middle East expert, so it is complicated, but it certainly seems like the rebels and one of the leaders of the rebels has, an ISIS affiliation, and that we may have just replaced one horrible regime with another one. There's, a power vacuum there with Assad gone, having ruled that country for, his family for, my gosh, decades now. And so we're trying to, I guess, manage the situation. We've airstrikes. We've Biden administration initiated airstrikes on ISIS targets. So we'll see what happens. But I mean, it's obviously a mess. And the Biden administration's attitude was we have to get in and by the way, some of the media as well. I mean, woke up this morning and read the Washington Post. They had four straight articles from Max Boot, David Ignatius, Josh Rogan, and an editorial basically saying we need to get involved. The Americans, must help try and fashion and shape a new, better Syria. Meanwhile, to your point, on the other side, you've got, Donald Trump saying, "Listen, this is not our fight. We shouldn't get involved." And folks on the sort of MAGA side, we ran a couple pieces on that today on Real Clear Politics. Francis Sempa and the American Spectator saying, "Listen, we need to really be cautious in our approach to Syria. We don't want to get involved in just another debacle in the Middle East." So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, particularly as you mentioned, Andy, where you've got a current administration that's going in one direction and an incoming administration that maybe doesn't want to do any of these things.
Yeah, it reminded me, I forget who said it, but you may not be interested in the Middle East, but the Middle East is interested in you, Carl. This is probably going to be something that it's going to be right, on the president's plate, President Trump's plate. It already is, I guess, and he's going to have to deal with it one way or the other.
Well, but he's signaling that he doesn't think it's America's responsibility to set up a new government in Syria. And if you look at, you could look for the last 70 years. When Eisenhower left office, Andy, there were all these stories. As there are now when Biden's leaving office. The good things that was done in the administration, the bad things. Everybody wrote how great it was. They'd replaced. They had this new government in Iran, the Shah. This was going to be great. Iran was going to be a big democracy for years. And you look at what a mess Lebanon is now, and you think about Iraq only now getting on its feet. The idea that America can go in there and make a better Syria, you think we might have learned that it's not as easy as it sounds over the last decades. But there's, the geopolitical aspects can't be avoided by a commander in chief. When Israel was invaded on October 7th, 2023 by these terrorists, Hamas, Israel didn't respond the way Netanyahu didn't respond the way most of the world wanted to respond. And he sort of waged unrelenting war on Hamas. Hezbollah joined the fight. He took it to Hezbollah. Israel has even bombed targets in Iran. And what this seems to have left Iran weakened, and it couldn't prop up Assad anymore. And you might, there's some self-serving stuff coming out of the Biden administration. We also pinned down, Vladimir Putin in Ukraine, or the Ukrainians pinned him down. So they couldn't help Syria, but it seems to be, there's some truth to that. This Ba'ath party that Assad and his father ran, and that Saddam Hussein was a Ba'athist, that was inspired directly by Joseph Stalin. And, now the old remnants of the Soviet Union has lost its client states there. There's a vacuum. It'd be nice if they were friendly governments to the United States, but it seems to me history showed us that if we want friendly governments to the United States, the best thing we can do maybe is nothing.
Yeah, well, we do have 900 American troops in the south of the country at a base in Syria. And the Russians, of course, have a naval base there. So there's a lot of strategic things to think about here. It's not, I don't know. I mean, it'd be nice to think that we could just sort of sit back and watch what happens, but that's rarely been the case up till now, at least. But I'm wondering too, because what struck me about it too was just the rapidity with which the regime collapsed.
But that was on nobody's radar. Nobody even knew these rebels were still around. And
right.
We saw some little stories about 14 days ago, and suddenly they're gone. That the Syrian government collapsed, much the way, the way the Taliban took over in Afghanistan, and that government collapsed. And it shows you, it shows you these client states. Now, Assad was never a client state of us. He was more of Russia. But these client states in the Mideast don't always do well in civil wars.
Yeah, and they are built on feet of clay. I mean, I would just say if you're in Tehran right now, you're looking at this going, this is not a good thing, and it who knows what will be next. I mean, these things don't tend to stay contained. But I want to talk too about Donald Trump. He was on Christian Welker of NBC News, interviewed him. Pretty interesting interview. Tom, I'm going to play a little bit of what he talked about Kash Patel.
You campaigned on destroying the deep state. Do you want Kash Patel to launch investigations into people on that list?
No, I mean, he's going to do what he thinks is right.
Do you think that's right? Do you think that's right, sir?
If they think that somebody was dishonest or crooked or a corrupt politician, I think he probably has an obligation to do it. But
are you going to direct him to do it?
No, not at all.
Are you going to go after Joe Biden?
I'm really looking to make our country successful. I'm not looking to go back into the past. I'm looking to make our country successful. Retribution will be through success. If we can make this country successful, that would be that would be such a great achievement.
Tom, what do you make of that? It was sort of a more thoughtful Donald Trump, it seemed to me. When you watch the whole interview, it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, very sort of forward-looking and pragmatic and focused on, tackling the issues that the American people voiced their support for in November. He talked about, the deportations. He was asked, she asked him about the 2020 election. I mean, he didn't really take the bait. And so he kind of turned it around on her a little bit. I thought it was a good interview. And, we can talk about why Donald Trump did this interview and why he gave Kristen Welker, continues to give folks in the mainstream media, including her, who was part of a debate that was, she was not an unbiased moderator. Her program has not been unbiased, and he decided to give his first interview to her. Thought that was interesting. But overall, I agree. It was very much a forward-looking interview. And, we'll see whether that's the Trump, whether that's the Trump we get when he gets into office. But as of right now, I thought it was a pretty positive interview for him.
Yeah, Carl, what do you make of it?
Well, there were a couple of contrasts that while I was watching it, that it brought to mind. One is that, Kamala Harris ran for president. It wasn't ideal. She had, 3 months, but she didn't take any hostile questions in that 3 months. She insulated herself from having to talk to anybody who would, and then she gave that interview to Brett Baier, and they cut it short. When he started asking questions they didn't like, her staff cut it off, and Trump didn't cut this off. And then the other contrast in my mind was to Joe Biden, who struggled to even read the anodyne statement that was written out for him about Syria. And it made me sad, but it also worried me. You point out, Andy, we only have one president at a time. Well, that president officially is Joe Biden, and Donald Trump is sounding more presidential now than Biden. And we still got 6 weeks to go.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, guys, we're going to have to leave it there. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Carl Cannon and Tom Bevan. We're going to take a break and be back after this.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP, joined now by Al Fromm. He is the founder of the DLC and the author of the book, The New Democrats and the Return to Power. Al, thanks for joining me. Appreciate it.
I'm delighted to be with you.
Well, you wrote a piece for the Bulwark, which we linked to on Real Clear Politics this morning, talking about the DLC, and the title that was put on the piece is What It Took to Fix the Democratic Brand Last Time Around. And you offer, I guess, 5 pieces of advice for the Democratic Party as it currently sits. Let's walk through those sort of one at a time. The first that you mentioned was that the DLC, as I mentioned, which you helped you co-founded, I guess,
Yes.
Had a clear purpose to develop an agenda. take me back through your thinking at that moment in time when you were developing this idea for the DLC. What was what was going through the Democratic Party at that point and your mind when you were looking at that?
Well, very simply, in the three elections of the 1980s, Democrats had the worst performance of any party in three consecutive elections ever. We lost more than 40 states in all of them. And after the 1988, we had lost 49 states in 1984, and we actually lost 49 also in 1972. Then in 1988, everybody thought we were going to win the election with Michael Dukakis, and it wound up being a landslide like the other two. And it became very clear to me that the Democratic Party was out of power, it was out of touch, but it also was out of ideas. We were trying to sell a product that nobody wanted to buy. And so our challenge was to develop a product, a set of ideas, an agenda consistent with democratic values that the American people would want to support. And that was our mission. It wasn't very complicated. We believed in idea-based politics.
And so as you were, the other thing you mentioned is the DLC sort of offered Democrats a new face. And I mean, obviously, Bill Clinton was the sort of North Star of the DLC. But as you looked around, who were the other members of the DLC? Who were the other folks that you gathered into your orbit?
Well, after 1985, it was clear that we needed generational change. With Walter Mondale's defeat, basically the old Democratic Party, New Deal era party was basically over, and it was time for new faces. And we had organized a group in the House led by Dick Gephardt and Tim Wirth, and another group of people. Al Gore was part of that. And so we went to Democratic governors like Chuck Robb, Bruce Babbitt, Bill Clinton, and a new group of senators, including Joe Biden at the time and Sam Nunn. And basically, this was a group of people, all of whom wanted to be president, but they realized that if they didn't do something to fix the Democratic brand, none of them would make it. And so what we did is took that group in small, 3 or 4 of them at a time, and went around the country in key states and said, this is the new face of the Democratic Party. Now, it was a different time in terms of the way you got media, and newspapers were important. Television was a lot more important. And we got local television, and we eventually cracked the national media when a Washington Post reporter came on a trip to ours in North Carolina, and we had such a good reaction in an event in a rainstorm that he barely could get in the room and wrote a front page story saying this is a new force in the party. So essentially what we did is took a bunch of wannabes who probably, in the words of Paul Taylor, the Post couldn't fill a firehouse on their own, but together they became a new force, and they became a defining force, a critical mass in the new Democratic Party.
And you talk about how you came up with this agenda on the economy, on crime, on national security.
Yeah.
How did you guys formulate the agenda there? Did you focus group it? I mean, how did you go about crafting what would be the DLC agenda that eventually would win in 1992 with Bill Clinton?
Well, an important part of the Democratic Leadership Council was that we were independent. I mean, we basically, we were an insurgent group. We created our own playing field, which we did our own conferences, and we didn't have any connection with the DNC. We were not sanctioned by them or not part of them or the other party organizations. That was important because it allowed us really to operate on our own and carve a new agenda. What we did with the agenda was after the 88 election that most people thought we were going to win, we did a hard-nosed analysis. I called it reality therapy of why we lost. And, we no longer had the excuse in 88 that it was Ronald Reagan and he was such a great talent. we basically decided that we lost because we were out of touch with the American people on the economy, security, and values. So we put together a small think tank and developed a bunch of ideas. And we didn't focus group them. We didn't have money to go out and focus group them or poll them because we instinctively knew what the problems were. We stayed away from day-to-day fights, which is important because if you get mired down in day-to-day fights, you can't do any redefinition. So we picked a number of what I'd call defining ideas: national service, which is now AmeriCorps; welfare reform; the expanded earned income tax credit, which turned out to be really important; charter schools; community policing; reinventing government. Those were big areas, and either Bill Clinton and I in the 90-91 period or other DLC members took them around the country, and we met with small groups and talked to them, and we sort of honed the ideas and then shaped them into first a political philosophy, which we articulated at a big conference in New Orleans called the New Orleans Declaration. And then secondly, we put together the best of those ideas into an agenda, which we approved at a convention we held in Cleveland in 1991, where Clinton gave the keynote speech. And that really turned out to be one of the most significant speeches he ever gave, because it sort of put him on the national scene as a leading candidate. And then later in the year, when he decided to run, he took that agenda into the primaries.
We're speaking with Al Fromm. He's a founder of the DLC and also the author of the book, The New Democrats and Their Return to Power. Al, so let's fast forward now. Here we sit. Democrats have just suffered sort of a bruising defeat at the hands of Donald Trump. What do you think? Do you see any of that same sort of reflection, introspection about the reasons for the loss, how things might be different? And also part B of that question is, do you see any of the current folks who are on the Democratic stage as being the kind of candidate that could make those changes or sell those changes credibly to the American people?
Well, first of all, it's a little early after the election. We're still in the period of a lot of people reacting, a lot of finger pointing and all that, but that'll all play out in the next couple of months. I look at it and say, there's some, we're not at bedrock like we were in 1984, 1988. But I do believe there are some trends in the election that if we continue to lose working class voters, Hispanic working class voters, more Black male working class voters, if we don't arrest those trends, it's not a good thing. I mean, we'll be back in the wilderness again. Look, I think there are three things Democrats need to do. First, those who are in governing responsibilities in the Congress and the governors need to, organize well enough to try to stop the worst things Trump will want to do. I mean, he's talked yesterday about putting Liz Cheney and Benny Thompson in jail. I mean, we need a good, solid opposition to some of the things he wants to do. The second thing I think we need to do is I think we do need a DLC-like operation. And I think it probably would be led by governors, because we have a lot of good governors around the country, to redefine the party in a way that is consistent with our values, but that people want to support. It's awfully hard to win in a democracy if you don't have ideas people don't want to support. And the third thing I think we need to do is I think we need to figure out how we can get some social media platforms and all the new communication means that I don't really understand, because it's generations much after mine, but to communicate, because it's clear that the traditional knocking on doors, get out the vote, was no match for the Trump and the Republican ability to use social media and other platforms to communicate with their voters. Do I think there are leaders? Yes, I do. I could go through, a half a dozen governors who I think are terrific, We've got two governors who probably would be considered potential candidates who are term limited. Gavin Newsom of California, Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan. I think they have terrific appeal, but you've got younger governors, Andy Beshear in Kentucky, Josh Shapiro, Wes Moore, Jared Polis in Colorado. I think there are a lot of governors. I'm sure there are people in the Senate. I've always been a big fan of Michael Bennet, who I think has a good sense of what we'd have to do. I've been very impressed with Alyssa Slotkin, the new senator-elect from Michigan. I don't know the House as well. I'm just a little bit away from that, but I'm sure that, you got people like Abigail Spanberger, who going to run for governor of Virginia, who was in the House, who are very attractive candidates. So I think we have a lot of candidates who'll do it. But I think, it'd be very helpful to the party if for a year or two, they just said, we'll go and do our own campaigns, but we're also going to devote time to this greater project of redefining the Democratic Party, because it'll make it easier for any of them to win if the party is more palatable to the voters going in.
We've got just a minute or so left, Al, and I want to ask you, you mentioned in your piece that one of the things that the DLC did was they issued identity politics.
Yeah.
And there's this big debate going on now. Did being woke cost the Democratic Party in this election? And is that something that they have to, move away from going forward? What's your opinion on that? Do you think being too woke costs and being too sort of vested in identity politics was one of the problems for the Democratic Party, and will continue to be if they don't change their tack on that?
I've always believed that identity politics has grave limitations. There's certain arrogance to say that people are going to vote this way or that because of their race or ethnic group or gender or whatever. I believe I believe in diversity, and I believe you can rally a diverse coalition if you have the right ideas and you plant a flag and you rally people around it. That was the formula we used, and I think that is a formula for today. I don't want to get into, whether we should have done this or that in the campaign. I think it's pretty clear that the trans ad hurt a lot because it made a lot of people think that Democrats were just sort of out of the mainstream. But the way to build a diverse coalition is just to plant that flag and get people of all races and all ethnic groups and all genders to rally around it in common purpose. The other problem we face, that the party always faces, because we're an interest group party, is that there are two ways to try to build unity. One is to go to everybody, say, what do you want? And then add them all up. And that usually is a losing formula. The other way is to create a sense of national purpose and and attract people from all the groups who want to pursue that national purpose and then can figure out how they can be part of it. So, but the basic difference, I think, is you got to stand for the right things. What you stand for matters. And if you plant the flag with what you stand for and people want to support it, you'll put together as diverse a coalition, and a coalition that will do our groups better than you would if you tried to go to each one of them and say, what do you want? And we'll try to get it for you separately.
All right, we will leave it there for today. Al Fromm, founder of the DLC. Al, thanks for joining me. Really appreciate it.
Great. Happy to do it.
All right. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM after this.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief of Real Clear Politics, talking now with Phil Wegmann, our White House correspondent. And Phil's covering the dying days of the administration. I don't mean melodramatic, but he's covering the last days of the Biden-Harris administration. And Phil, over the weekend, you got a question, and tell our listeners about that. And then I'm going to ask you some questions about covering it. And we can compare notes on, I covered Bush and Clinton. Now you're covering Biden. We talk about the differences.
So, in the final days of the Biden administration, you have seen a president who has receded from center stage. There are some Democrats who are complaining that he has given the spotlight to Donald Trump. And we saw this when the president elect was in Notre Dame, and a number of G7 world leaders were very eager to speak with him and almost deal with him as if he was already president. We saw this also when, the Canadian Prime Minister traveled not to Washington, D.C. last week, but to Mar-a-Lago. And I think that with Biden, his focus now is very clearly on one thing, and that is reestablishing the peaceful transfer of power and then riding off into the sunset. He's getting his ducks in a row. He's finishing his unfinished business that he can without Congress, and then he's ready to exit center stage.
Well, and these pardons have attracted some attention, not all of it positive. I wanted to ask you about that, though, Phil. The administration, this incoming administration, I've never seen anything quite like it. But then again, you and I weren't alive for Grover Cleveland. Donald Trump is not an unknown entity. He's been president before. I got the feeling watching him in France that some of these leaders are trying to do a reset, and maybe they got off on the wrong foot on Trump. They maybe have underestimated him, or for whatever reason, underestimated his capacity to hurt them. What am I reading too much into it, or are these foreign leaders trying to think maybe they can do a better job this time around with Trump than they did before?
It was striking that you had Emmanuel Macron, who invited Trump to France for a ceremony commemorating the rebuilding of Notre Dame at a moment when all of these world leaders were trying to rebuild their own relationships with Trump. I think one thing that has changed is, first, they already lived through the last 4 years of Donald Trump. They saw how it wasn't a government by bureaucracy or agent. It was instead a government by one man who often changed his mind pretty frequently and immediately told you about it. But I think the other thing that's occurring here, even if you look to France, is that some of these world leaders have seen populism rise up in their own countries. They're realizing that this is not a one-off, and that Donald Trump is perhaps a example of what's more to come. I think that's one significant change here. But the other thing is, the world very much is on fire currently, and the United States continues to be the world's biggest player.
So let me ask you about the White House press secretary. She's been under the gun in the last week. She was the one that said over and over again that the Hunter Biden pardon would not happen. The president said it himself a couple of times, but it was her reiteration of that many times, and with a little bit of attitude that has put her in the crosshairs. What is she like in these days? What's her attitude as she gets ready to leave with the president?
She's not letting the Iron Mask slip. At this last press briefing that we had on Friday, every reporter basically asked her if she was being honest with the American people, if the president was being honest with her when he gave her this information that she said again and again over the summer that the president would not pardon his own son. We even asked that question on numerous occasions. Now the argument is that circumstances have changed, that Donald Trump and his incoming administration, they're out for vengeance. And so it was okay for the president to do what he promised not to. The thing about this, though, is Donald Trump's character and his eagerness to settle the score. That's not new. We could have said that at last December. We're saying it now. Instead, I think that what Biden decided to do was make this move when there was no more political risk to him, and so someone has to face the music. It's not the president. Instead, it's his press secretary, and this is becoming more of a theme. The two big promises from President Biden this year was first that he wasn't going to withdraw from the race. And then he did that. And now these pardons. All of Washington, D.C. now is buckling up to see who he pardons next.
You're listening to Phil Wegmann, White House correspondent for RealClearPolitics. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington bureau chief. You're listening to RCP Radio on Sirius XM or on our podcast, which we are expanding. So whatever format you're listening to, welcome. Phil, I want to ask you another thing. but I remember the contrast with Bill Clinton when he was president. He left, and George H.W. Bush was coming in. Clinton had also been impeached like Trump. He had also, like Trump, weathered it because he had said it was a partisan exercise. The majority of American people sided with President Clinton on that. But there's also and he had lost. He wanted his vice president to take over too, and that didn't happen. But the contrast that I see is Bill Clinton didn't look like he wanted to leave. I mean, he loved it. He did the White House Correspondents. They did the skit of him being home alone, and everybody wants him out of there. He doesn't want to leave, and he did rallies his last day on January 20th, and he was actually speaking while Bush was, still president or become president. He hogged the camera, and it's forgotten now, and people don't think he meant anything bad towards Bush about it. He just loved the job. He loved politics so much. He couldn't wait. He just didn't want to go. Are you getting some of that feeling with Biden, or is it the opposite? There's a different thing. He's not able to run again because he's deemed to be too old. Is he just really wanting to get back to Delaware, or do you get the feeling that he'd like to be there another 4 years if he had his way?
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but President Clinton is a younger man than Joe Biden. And I think that this is a mix of political exhaustion, but also personal exhaustion. It's a grueling schedule for any president. At the end of 4 years, Biden is looking to take a break. We were members of the traveling press pool with him yesterday as he was at the Kennedy Center Awards. And certainly, he did his best to celebrate each of the honorees. But as I was there at the Kennedy Center, and as I got closer and closer to 11 o'clock, I had to be thinking to myself, this is getting to be a little taxing, a little trying on Biden.
Who's 82 years old? I mean,
he's 82 years old. And
so you got in a question there, didn't you?
I did.
Yeah.
One of the things that we did not expect, no one expected, was that Bashar al-Assad, his regime that has been in control of Syria for half a century, would crumble, and it crumbled very quickly. This opens up all sorts of questions about the chemical weapons that are there, about the power vacuum that is there, and in particular, of interest to every journalist, the fate of a gentleman named Austin Tice. He's a journalist, an American, who was taken captive back in 2012, and there had been sort of competing reports of whether or not he was alive, where he was being held, and what we heard from the Biden administration yesterday is that they, in fact, do believe that he is alive. In a gaggle after President Biden's remarks, my question to him was whether or not the White House was going to direct the armed services to mount an operation to go get him. And the answer that I got from President Biden was, first, they had to figure out where he was.
Well, and Biden's had some success this year with bringing hostages back. My guess is that they'd prefer a diplomatic solution. Phil, as I think about it, and we have about 30 more seconds, that'd be a nice Christmas present for Joe Biden to give to Austin Tice's family. It'd be a nice Christmas present for the American people and for President Biden himself on the way out the door. Do you think is your guess they'll put some energy into trying to make this happen?
I think they're working overtime to not only bring Austin home, but also in this Syria development, they see this as corroboration of their efforts. They say that Iran cut and ran because they couldn't keep up their war with Israel thanks to U.S. support there. They say that Russia pulled out of Syria because of U.S. efforts in Ukraine. So this is sort of a bittersweet, at least in their mind, confirmation of the outgoing president's foreign policy. And they would love nothing more to put a bow on it than to bring an American home for the holidays.
Well, that would be a wonderful present. We're going to leave it there. You've been listening to Phil Wegmann, White House correspondent for RealClearPolitics. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington bureau chief, and we'll see you tomorrow on SiriusXM at 3 o'clock in the West, 6 p.m. here in the East, or on our podcast. So have a good evening.